Singers classic, Side by Side. So stand with us as we sing. Side by side we stand, awaiting God's commands, worshiping the saving King, living by His grace and moving on in faith. Jesus Himself will see us through. Meet me in heaven, or we'll join hands together. Meet me by the Savior's side. I'll meet you in heaven. We'll sing songs together. Brothers and sisters, I'll be there. Soldiers all are we to go where Jesus leads. We'll fight in faith and we will overcome. Heaven is our goal and saving every soul. Pray that we all will be there. Meet me in heaven, we'll join hands together. Meet me by the Savior's side. I'll meet you in heaven. We'll sing songs together. Brothers and sisters, I'll be there. Praise the Lord, we all will be there. Let's open with prayer. Lord and Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this day. Thank you for the opportunity to come together and open the Word of God, particularly with Eugene as he shares it with us. And I pray that your Spirit will be on him and your Spirit would be working in us, Lord, to help us to comprehend what it is that we would learn, what it is that you would have us grow and become into from your Word. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.
In our second meeting with Abdullah, he had a really hard question for us. When I say for us, it really was for me. He's from Yemen, and he left Yemen to study in Malaysia. And while he was there, he learned about Jesus. He decided he believed in the Bible and the prophets. He wanted to be a Christian. But now in our second meeting, the question was, is it okay for a Christian to marry a Muslim? Now, let me give you a little background for Abdullah so you can understand some things. In Yemen, it takes typically a dowry of $3,000 to $5,000 to get married, besides the wedding expense. But many people in Yemen earn $100 or $200 a month. And when you earn $100, $200 a month, and of course, as a young person, you come in the entry level of the working system. And so to have enough money to get married, many people get married in their late 30s and 40s and even older than that because it takes them that long to save money to get married. And so Mr. Abdullah, he and his high school sweetheart had been planning marriage for a long time. I don't mean months, I don't mean 2 or 3 years, I mean many years. And now that he was in Malaysia and making some more money, he finally had achieved that position where he could marry her, you know, after waiting many years. And now he's becoming a Christian. And he had talked it through with her. She was okay with him being a Christian, but she wasn't interested herself. And so that was his question. Is it okay for a Christian to marry a Muslim? And what do you think, audience? Is it okay or not okay? Well, don't you feel bad for Abdullah? Don't you just pity him? Just like 1 Corinthians 3 and 6 addressing this question. It's a hard test for you who grew up as an Adventist. Isn't it a hard test even for young people today? Even you grow up in the faith, even for you, that's a pretty serious obstacle to maintain holiness. And here's a man who is a baby Christian, still in diapers, and being confronted with this, and he's been waiting longer for marriage than you ever did. I don't know you. I hope more than you did. I hope more. And so, as God's representatives and as ambassadors for heaven, we don't really have the option to lower the standard to meet the needs of people. We don't really have an option to change the truth to make it fit what someone wants to hear. We don't. And so I told Abdullah in the most sensitive way I could manage. I'm not a very sensitive guy, so that doesn't go always well for me, but I tried to just compassionately let him know that, no, it's not okay. It's not okay. However, maybe we can sit down with your intended and study with her. Maybe we can bring her up to speed. Maybe, lots of possibilities I had in mind. Maybe we can save this thing. What I noticed from that minute over the next few months is Abdullah's interest in the Bible significantly reduced. When he understood the cost seemed very high. And I don't know, when you're doing God's work, if the people you're working with ever understand the cost, but the cost to be a Christian is significant. And did Jesus encourage us to count it or not count it? What do you say? We ought to count it. He doesn't want us making any blind commitments without knowing how expensive it is. He wants us to know. And Abdullah was confronted with it, and he just began to think, and he just wasn't ready to break off his relationship with his fiancée over his newfound faith. So it wasn't long after that I had to leave Malaysia. I did leave Malaysia, and I couldn't come back because of the pandemic. Made a real mess out of that. And while I was gone, I had people who were still following up with Abdullah, and it just seemed like that glowing red ember was cooling down, and it's just, what can you do? If you've been a Bible worker, you win some, you lose some. But then I got a message from a man who told me about Zayed. Zayed, I heard his testimony. We have an online church, a Zoom Adventist fellowship that meets every Sabbath, and it has a few Australians that meet there. They are from very rural places here in Australia where there's no church, but mostly it's for people in close countries who have become Adventist but don't have any way to go to church, no way to have fellowship. It's mostly for them. So we have attendees from Iraq and Iran and from Afghanistan and Yemen and people like that are coming. And Zayed shared his testimony there just 3 weeks ago. It was a beautiful testimony. But I'll tell you my perspective, because my perspective differs from his a bit about his own experience. Zayed came to Malaysia and quickly developed some doubts about Islam. Maybe you don't know, but Yemen has become much more skeptical about its religion than it was 15, 20 years ago. I say that when I meet a new Yemeni person, there's a 1 in 3 chance he'll take an interest in the gospel. That's better than a Baptist chance. That's better than a Church of Christ chance. That's even a little better than an atheist chance. Atheists are typically easier to reach than other people. But Yemeni people are just very responsive right now. And Zayed, there in Malaysia, he decided to investigate Christianity. Malaysia isn't a great country for investigating Christianity. There aren't a lot of Christians. So he did the Google thing. He began searching online. And what he found online was basically Catholicism. Catholicism is a step up from Islam, or a step sideways, but for him it was a step up, and he accepted Jesus in Catholicism. That is, he didn't know there was such thing as Catholicism and Protestantism. He wasn't that far along in his searching. But what he found was a Jesus who was God, who had died for his sins, and he latched onto that and became a Christian in the university there in Malacca, and he began sharing his faith with people. And it caused him trouble immediately, because Zayed was there on a national scholarship paid for by sponsors in the Yemeni government, and the word got back to them that he had become a Christian, and they immediately cut his funding. So Zayed suddenly had no tuition money. And so that's when I heard about him. Someone told me about him, and I found his contact, and I wrote him, and he began taking Adventist Bible studies. He had never seen anything like that before about Daniel, and today he's a Seventh-day Adventist, but I put a little note on Facebook, and someone agreed to pay his tuition. So he got back in school, and he began reaching out to people there in the university while he was studying. Now he has his PhD in engineering, especially in the field of radio frequencies, kind of that business. And but then he was making progress, sharing his faith at the campus, and someone else that was going to school in that same school was Abdullah. And as Abdullah was watching Zayed at a distance, what he began to see was that same kind of love and zeal for Jesus that he had had months before. And it began to make him feel like he had lost something. And Abdullah began to join Zayed in his studies and began to help him in his evangelism. And when Abdullah, who also now has a PhD, was accepted into a research position in France, that's where he attends church today, the Adventist church there in France. When he went there, Zayed stayed in Malaysia, and now Abdullah's wife has finally taken an interest in the faith. She's already come to church once, and she's looking into things, and you can pray that God will finish the work he started there. But Abdullah is coming along. So in Bible work, you win some, you lose some, and you win some of the ones you lost. Right? You hold on to people, and you can see what God can do with that. Do you have Bibles with you? I'd like you to turn in your Bibles to James. James chapter 4. I'm going to have a Q&A, not at the end of what I'm doing, but kind of in the middle of it. Because I think some of you have come and you might have questions about how to reach Muslims, and I think I know a lot more about it now than I did 8 years ago. That's how long I've been working in that field, trying to, and when I go into a field to learn something, I don't start out thinking I know a lot. I start out doing lots of experiments. I start out, try this, try that, try this, try that. When I was planting a church in Arkansas, I remember someone asked me, because the church plant succeeded in Arkansas. There's a thriving church there that's sent out missionaries now to the 1040 window already. It's a strong church. And someone asked me, so what was the great technique you used there in Arkadelphia, Arkansas? How did the church get going? And I told them there never was a great technique. We tried the county fair, and we got one lady that way. And we tried canvassing, and we got one lady that way. And we tried door-to-door Bible study surveys, and we got one lady that way and one man that way. And we tried lots and lots of things. And nothing we did brought in 10. We did a whole prophecy series. And the only person that was baptized was the one that unlocked the door for us every evening. And but is it worth it for her? It's worth it for her, and within 6 months of her baptism, she was giving studies to everyone on her road. She's now in charge of the Correspondence Bible School program in that church, and this has been 14 years now. And was there anything that really helped in raising up the church? There really was nothing that was like a game changer, but the game changer is just to keep trying stuff. You just try, you just try, you just try. I hope you're still in James 4. We will be reading something in a minute, but I'm telling you that when I went to Bangladesh to train the teachers how to win their students for Jesus, because they have thousands of Muslim students in Bangladeshi Adventist schools, thousands of them. And in the last 20 years, somewhere between 0 and 0 have become Christians. So I was there to try to make a change in that system, to do what we can. Because in Malaysia, we have a primary school, and about 4 and 5 become Christian of the Muslim students. So what I'm telling you, what I found there in Bangladesh is that it wasn't because they were lacking some technique. It's because they weren't trying anything. It's because they weren't trying. It's because the teachers weren't making an effort. And if you have a bunch of bungling, loving teachers making an effort to win their students for Christ, you know what's going to happen? They're going to win their students for Christ. If you have a bunch of bungling teachers making their best effort, trying 100 different things to win their students for Jesus, they're going to end up winning a lot of students for Jesus, not because they have such amazing methods. It's because they tried, because they reached out, and did something. James chapter 4, look at verse 7. Therefore, submit to God, resist the devil, and he will, what does it say? In Muslim nations, there is a great deal of superstition and fear of spirits. I don't know if this is true in the Middle East. I've never lived in the Middle East, but I'm thinking right now of where most of the Muslims in the world are, and that's in Asia. So Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India. I'm thinking of that part of the world. And that has more than half of the Muslims of the world are right there. And in that area, there is a great fear of the spirits. Even Adventists that come in from Hinduism or Buddhism in those areas, they come into Adventism with a real cognizance, a real awareness, if you will, of the spirits, worried to go to some places, worried of haunted homes and haunted situations. And do you need to be worried about the spirits? Do you see what it says there in James 4? Like, how hard is it to make the devil run? Does it take incantations? Do you need, if you find a demon-possessed person, do you need to put a Bible on his chest and put a key inside the cover and then say a special prayer? Is that how to make the devil run? How do you do it in James 4:7? You refuse to give in to his temptations. That's how you make the devil run. You refuse to follow your urge to lie, steal, kill, or cheat. You refuse to indulge yourself when you know better. You resist the devil and he will flee from you. This idea that we have a religion that doesn't need to be afraid of the spirits is a big edge that we have on Islam. If you come to Bangladesh someday and you look at little children, you'll see something quite curious. They all have the same birthmark. I mean, they have a little black thing right here, a little black circle on the side of their head. You'll see hundreds of little boys like this and little girls. It's not a birthmark. It is a superstitious effort to repress or to repel the evil eye. When I say the evil eye, I don't mean the one that Jesus mentions in the Sermon on the Mount. I mean a different idea altogether. The Islamic evil eye is the idea that if I look on you with envy, if I see that you have so much money and I'm thinking, and I look like that, the Islamic idea is that my envy, the ill will in my envy, can level a curse on you of bad luck and cause terrible things to happen. And since children are so perfectly innocent and cute, of course, everyone is envious of a beautiful little child. And so you must put that little paint right there to ward off that evil eye, that the envious cursing, if you will. And I've done this because we're in 2024. I've said to intelligent, educated people in Bangladesh, I say, that thing on your child's, is that because you really believe it will help? Or is it just you're following tradition? And I've been surprised over and over when they say, oh, I believe it. So we have something over Islam in that we are not afraid of spirits. I hope you're not afraid of spirits. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Verse 8. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. That passage says that how close you are to Jesus is not a function of who was your teacher in Christianity. If Abdullah wants to get closer to Jesus this week, he doesn't have some benchmark like, if I'm this close to Jesus, Abdullah isn't limited to that. No one is a benchmark for you of how close you can get. If you draw closer to him, you will be closer to him. Your children may be closer to him than you are, not because your children have had more time, to get close to him, more years, but because they're making more effort than you are. If you are drawing close to God in your consecration and your Bible study and your prayer if you draw close to him, what does he do in this verse? He draws close to you. This is the reason why Jesus was closer to James and John. It's not, especially John, it's not that Jesus played favorites. It's not that he looked for the least troublesome student and really bonded to him. I think John was one of the more troublesome students. But John drew close to Jesus, and Jesus never put up a barrier. He never said, I'm sorry, you're not going to get closer than that. He never said, this is the limit. We want to keep everyone about the same distance to maintain equality among the disciples. Jesus never stopped people from getting close to him. James 4, verse 9. Lament, mourn, and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. I would almost wager that you've never heard a sermon on that verse ever in your life. Almost wager on that. Let's just try to figure a bit out what that's about. Look in your Bibles at Ecclesiastes 7. Turn in your Bibles to Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 7. When rain starts to fall, it sounds like static on the line. It made me worried for a minute. Ecclesiastes 7, we'll start in verse 1. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. What is Solomon and James, what are they communicating to us? One thing they're communicating is that the Spirit has an easier time separating us from our sins when we're thoughtful and considerate than when we're having hilarity and glee. When it comes to moving us to make a change in the right direction, the Spirit has more success in us. Did you see it here in Ecclesiastes 7? It said, for by the sadness of the heart, the countenance, or by the sadness of the countenance, the heart is made better. It's this idea that when you are in private, could be, that's when God makes a lot of progress with you. And when, on the other hand, you're full of laughing and joking and having a party and a good time. Sure, you're enjoying yourself, but the still small voice just doesn't make a lot of progress compared to the party. The still small voice just isn't very, very well heard there. I don't say that God isn't speaking, but he just isn't heard. So these passages don't say that being joyful is wrong. If they did, it would perplex us, because we read a verse yesterday that said, rejoice in the Lord. Well, we didn't read that one. We read, rejoice evermore. And then we know Philippians, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. So we wouldn't say that happiness is wrong, but we would say that Jesus was a man of, do you know the next word? A man of sorrows. He was acquainted with grief. That is, in your life, in your daily life, you don't want to have a life of escapism, a life that tries to get away from uncomfortable thoughts and feelings by always being happy and partying and joy. You weren't made for that, and when you have that, it doesn't work out for you. I'm saying this to you, but I'm trying to create for you a picture so you can see something, and that is Islam knows very little about repentance. In Islam, there is a very wide requirement that ladies dress exceedingly much. I couldn't find a good adverb to finish that sentence. But for example, I think my wife Heidi dresses modestly. She dresses very nicely. But if she was wearing this right now in Bangladesh, people would be looking at her and saying that's scandalous. What they would expect her to add to what she's wearing now would be a scarf that would come around the back and go over the front. And if you go to Bangladesh, in any rural area, you'll see every lady walking around has a scarf like that. Bangladesh isn't the only place that has ideas about women's dress that to us seem a bit over the top. My church that's operating now in Afghanistan has been quite perplexed. One of the key ladies who's already won several people to Jesus, she wrote me almost a year ago, and you could tell in her writing that she was so distressed. She was reading through the first volume of the Testimonies. And have you read through the Testimonies? In the first volume of the 9-volume Testimonies, Ellen White describes her own experience there in New England when she was a young girl. And in that story, back in the 1830s, the ladies were wearing bonnets. And there were different styles of bonnets. And there were ones that were more standard and acceptable, and ones that were more skimpy and not acceptable. And she says something about bonnets in first volume of the Testimonies, but whoever translated that into Arabic was aiming at dynamic translation. Do you know that phrase, dynamic translation? Dynamic. It's where you're not trying to get the exact words. You're trying to say it in a way that they'll understand in their own context. And the most dynamic way they could get bonnet into Arabic was burqa. Is a bonnet and a burqa the same thing? I say beware of dynamic translation. Like, what you really want in life is literal translation. You want to know what the prophet said, and you can find the dynamic equivalent yourself. Let the reader find the dynamic equivalent. You want to know what the prophet said, because if someone in between tries to make it dynamic, how do you know they got it right? How do you know when it says burqa that the original writer wasn't saying bonnet? Do you follow what I'm trying to illustrate for you? So even in English, we have some of these dynamic translations, and I just say to you, do you really want those? But anyway, this lady wrote me because according to what she was reading in that poor translation, God was backing up the Taliban policy. You know what I mean? And she thought that Christianity was not like that. And I had to explain to her that when it comes to dress, that what God has or what God requires are two things, maybe even more than two, but two for that context. One of them is modesty. It's that you want to dress in a way that isn't showy and getting attention and isn't going to be provocative. That's one thing. But part of it does have to do with the culture, doesn't it? I mean that I think none of you are scandalized by Heidi being scarfless. Scarfless, is that a word? That you're not scandalized by that. That what God is, when God asked Heidi to wear a scarf, it's not because scarves are part of modesty. It's because scarves are part of culture. And that's what's needed to reach the culture. Gentlemen, you don't have to wear a scarf if you come join me in Bangladesh. There's nothing, in fact, you could go shirtless all day long. There's just some real inconsistency in the way people think in many places. Do any of you have questions about how to reach your Muslim friends, neighbors, associates, the refugees that moved in down the road? Sister in the back, you can ask as loud as you want to say, and I will reword it because I remember what you said to me this morning. You'd like to make up some lost time there. And I just love that question, that story, because it illustrates what's going on in Australia every day. Every day. Let me tell a story, then I'll answer your question. I was in Indonesia, and Heidi and I were walking. We walk every day. You might see us walking hand in hand here. When we do that in Bangladesh, our first time doing that in any place, people look at us because people don't hold hands in Bangladesh, but we do. And we were walking in Indonesia this time, and a man drove up on a motorcycle beside us and said, "Where are you going?" Well, since we're walking for exercise, we're actually walking for 23 minutes and turning around, because we want to walk 45 minutes. That's in our schedule. We're not going to a particular place. We're just 23 minutes in some random direction and then turn around and come back. That's hard to explain that to an Indonesian man on a motorcycle. "Where are you going?" "Well, that way." And he said, "Well, if you don't have a place in mind, come to my house." And so we diverted and came to his house. His name is Ayub. That's the Arabic version of Job. And when we came to Ayub's home, I found out that he grew up as a Muslim, but 5 years prior to that, he became a Hindu. He left Islam and became a Hindu. Why did he leave Islam? Well, partly it was because of this. It's because in Indonesia, in Java, where you have 100 million people in a small island, in Java, the price of land is so high that a typical laborer won't earn enough in a lifetime to buy more than a few meters of it. So he inherited, this guy, maybe a quarter of an acre from his dad. And while he was in Bandung, away from his homestead, working, when he came back, someone had built had stolen from him. Now, how many meters wide is I guess it's about 10 meters wide, so that's 10 square meters stolen from his land. Do you understand kind of the math of that? And that's more than he would earn working in Bandung for 30 years, but because it's a mosque, he can't fight it in court. He can't get it back. He can't, because it's a mosque, his hands are tied. He just loses his inheritance and it made him so spittin' angry that he left Islam. Is that a good reason to leave your religion? It might be a good reason to study. I mean, any reason is a good reason to study. You don't need a very good reason to research. You just, like anything that gets you to search is a good thing. But when he went to searching, Ayub first went to a Catholic church, and what he found there wasn't precious enough for him. Then he went to a Protestant church, that's what they called it. And what he found there was nothing supernatural there. And then he went to a Buddhist temple, and he didn't find anything supernatural there. But in the Hindu temple, he had a supernatural experience. And that settled it for him. Hinduism is not lacking in some miracles. And so he had there a spiritualist experience, and Ayub became a Hindu. And I was at his house, and I was going to try to interest him in Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8. But after his miracles that he had experienced, the miracle of prophecy, it was still interesting, but it was just on a par. It wasn't excelling. Let me see if I can say that to you again. Like for many people in Australia, when they see Daniel 2, it's amazing to them. They never have seen evidence of the supernatural before. And so it changes their view. But for Ayub, it was just another supernatural thing, and he was quite comfortable with the supernatural thing he already had. And so I was never able to get Ayub interested in the Bible. His wife became a Christian. His daughter studied, but I never was able to get him to take an interest in it. But I thought if I'd only met him 5 years earlier, certainly Ayub would have become a Seventh-day Adventist. I can't say certainly, because becoming an Adventist is a bit more than becoming another religion. Like I already mentioned the trouble Abdullah had. Like we have some values in our church, and maybe one of those would have been, like maybe if we required him to forgive the mosque builder, that might have been over the top for him. I can't know for certain what he would have done, but it seems like if I'd come 5 years earlier, maybe we would have got him. And so the emergency there is to be out there with the people, meeting the people. If you're not meeting them, you just lose those golden opportunities. So now to your question, sister. What can you do with your Muslim coworker? In this case, she is a new Muslim. She's not deeply into it, and that means probably the propaganda machine hasn't made tons of progress with her. I don't know if you know the key points of Islamic propaganda against Christianity, but there are some strong propaganda points. They do differ significantly in some of the big cities of the West and elsewhere. Like if you go to Birmingham in the UK, you'll see, at least I saw, I don't know if it's still there, Persia, Greece, Rome, breakup of Rome. It's just not very, very difficult. So if the Roman Catholic Church could eliminate some chapter from the Bible, you know what chapter they would really like to get rid of? It would be Daniel 7. They would just like to take it out. And the fact that it's there is in itself evidence that God has never given them the privilege of scrapping a chapter from the book. How many, there's like 30 of you here. How many of you understood what I just said? I'm happy. I don't get that many hands when I say things in Bangladesh. So all right, so this is good. So then come to Daniel 9. Daniel 9, that's that amazing prophecy that says that the Messiah is going to come within 490 years after a Persian decree. Even if you don't get the right Persian decree, even if you don't rightly interpret the end of the prophecy, just that very outline thought, 490 years from Persia's time is the Messiah. curious and want to know, let them know that don't use the word Bible when talking to your Muslim friends. Use the phrase the prophets. And that's what the Bible, how it talks about itself also. You know that when you read the Bible? The Bible doesn't say the Bible. What does the Bible say? The law and the prophets. Well, you can just skip the law part and say the prophets. And when you talk about the prophets, that their ignorance of the Quran is so much that they really don't, when you're quoting the prophets from the Bible, they don't even know it's not in the Quran, a lot of them. They just don't really know. In the Islamic religion, they believe the Quran only exists in Arabic, and in Indonesia and Malaysia, like, I know Russian and Spanish, and I know a lot of languages that way, but I don't know any of them, you know what I mean? I don't know any of them except English. So you're going to invite them to your house, you're going to talk in a way that matches them, but you're going to talk to them about hell. Because the Quran has a sadistic approach. I think I mentioned it yesterday to you, didn't I? Talk to you about it. So I won't go into, there's more details for sure about that. There's a tree that grows in the Quranic hell that has ghoulish heads. So it's like someone had a nightmare and wrote it all out, is what it's kind of like, this idea. And when you talk about your idea that God loves the sinner, what the Quran says is that God dislikes sinners. Don't you know that has to discourage hundreds of millions of people when they read that? Those would be the ones that do know Arabic. The rest never read it. But for the ones in the Middle East, they can read. It says, God dislikes sinners. If that was the truth, I would just give up. Wouldn't that just be terrible if you thought God didn't like sinners? And when you can say that God showed his love toward us and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. But there is an issue about Christ dying that if you understand it, it'll help you when the question comes up. Because in the Islamic mind, there's no justice in Jesus dying in place of you. To them, that's quite pagan. That's just human sacrifice. There's nothing about that you can call justice. And we even have an Adventism people that talk like that. Timothy Jennings, and I think Fred Wright has died a long time ago, and Dr. Cole and Graham Maxwell. If any of those sound like good names to you, please see me afterwards or ask a question about it. But all of them have a very similar approach to this as Islam has, to the atonement. So for Islam, what it says is that there's no justice in Jesus dying in your place. If you had a 17-year-old girl, what's the driving age here in Australia? When can you first drive by yourself? Okay, so if you had a 17-year-old girl and she came to you one day and said, Dad, you've been teaching me to drive now for 2 years, and I've driven a lot of times with you in the car, and I'm ready to go it alone. Would you loan me the keys so I can run down to see my friends? I'll be back in about an hour. Well, that's not a real easy moment for you, because even though you've been teaching her for a while, you know that she's not an experienced driver, and those kangaroos are stupid, and there's just some risk out there. And do you have if you can, but just hit it, don't swerve. So when she swerved, she was not following the counsel you gave her. So is that on her or on you? That's her. So you could say, Dear, you're paying for this. But who was it that gave her the keys? And that was you. Did you know that she was an inexperienced driver? You knew. You knew if she's going to have a wreck, today is one of the more likely days than other days. You knew that, but you took the risk anyway because you wanted her to be a driver someday. And so you just took, what I'm trying to illustrate for you is that Jesus has given us the 10 Commandments and told us how to live. So you can't say that it's his fault that we make bad decisions. You can't say that. But who gave us the keys? That's Jesus. Jesus is the creator. And as the one that gave us life, he is the one that can take responsibility for what we do with that life. He's the one that in justice can accept us in himself. So Gabriel can't die for me, but Jesus can as the creator. How many of you understand what I'm trying to say to you about the atonement? And because of that, it's perfectly just that Jesus would choose to take my... So sister, if you understand the atonement, you're ready for that. And then I think when you can share Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, these don't sound to her anti-Islamic. They just sound interesting. And if you wanted to use my studies, I think you might have my number, but I have your email, so I can send them to you. I'll send them to her. I can send them to any of you. Those studies go through Daniel 2, 7, 9, and 8, and through, there's 45 of them. They go through everything. But they do it in such a way that you can say, I found some scripts that are based on the prophets that Islam and Adventism share. I'd like to get your feedback on these. And you can just send them to her by email. And that doesn't sound like you're trying to change her religion. It sounds almost ecumenical. It's based on the prophets that Adventism and Islam shared. So which prophets is that? Would that include Moses? Do we share Moses? We do. Do we share Jesus? We do. It's all the prophets except Muhammad. It's the Bible. So that's why I say it that way. Based on the prophets that Adventism and Islam share. So it's not Ellen White and it's not Muhammad. And when they go through those studies and they see that, often that creates a seed of interest that you can easily fan into a conversion to Adventism. That would be my long answer to you. What time is it now? I did see Blair back there and wonder if I was blowing it. All right, well, let me pray for you and we'll be done. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, I'm asking that you would find a way to reach the Muslims of Australia, that you would find a way to use those of us who will interact with them here or elsewhere. Fill us with your Spirit. We ask in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Good morning. Hello, how are you? Welcome to Tuesday of camp. This morning, let me read to you from the book of Isaiah, chapter 55, verses 1 to 3. And it says this, "Is anyone thirsty? Come and drink, even if you have no money. Come, take your choice, it's all free. Why spend your money on food that does not give you strength? Why pay for food that does you no good? Listen to me and you will eat what is good, says the Lord. You will enjoy the finest food. Come to me with your ears wide open. Listen and you will find life." Would you join me in welcoming Ross this morning?
Not sure if I should have stepped on these. Good morning, everybody. What a beautiful day. And by God's grace, we're here and healthy enough to pay a little bit of attention, hopefully. Today, what I want to be able to take you through, you just know from the words that are there, paleo, Mediterranean, vegan, what diet's really healthy? And a lot of people try and break it down and go, well, I need to follow this particular regime and this particular regime. I'm going to talk a little bit about paleo particularly, and then I'll cover briefly the Mediterranean at the end. But what I'm hoping more to do is to give you the principles behind what the body actually needs, and then you'll have the opportunity, hopefully, with that information to be able to decide for yourself what's healthy for the body and what's not. Does that make sense? And hopefully discern, even when it comes to some of the fads that are out there, and there's a lot of them, whether or not you want to engage in it, or whether or not you think there might be something wrong with it, or whether or not you might just want to take some of it and leave some of it. So hopefully the principles will be something that's going to help you demystify some of these nutritional choices. So let's think about it first of all. What does actually the body need? Your body, what does it actually need? And I'm going to break it down to really just 6 things, all of them relatively simple. So the first thing we need is fuel. So you all know that we generate fuel out of what we eat. There's no other way of doing it. There was a lady, in fact, one time who was going around the US particularly saying that she could only live on air. She had certain philosophies on certain things, and she would just tell people, no, I never eat anything, I just need air. Is that possible? No. She came to a bit of a crashing end publicly when somebody had sneaked a camera into her hotel room and saw that she was scoffing chocolates and that sort of thing after she'd had the... No, we can't live on air, we have to live on something, and it's the way the body actually converts it from the food we eat, so everything that you had from dinner last night to ultimately breakfast this morning and any snacks in between. Don't put your hand up. But the point is the body actually uses that to generate the energy the body needs, and largely that's in the form of ATP, and we've got a couple of other little versions there as well. And so carbohydrates and fats are our professional sources of energy, and I'll talk about them a little bit later on in relation to which one might be something the body prefers. Then we've got the building materials. We think of those as proteins, and pretty much proteins in the body are what actually gives us, yes, there's some structural elements, but they also make up mostly a lot of what the factories are in the body. So a lot of the enzymes that does a lot of cruel stuff. Now, if this were a biochemistry group, I would love to just take a little side step and just show you some of the brilliance of some of that biochemistry. Absolutely genius. Beyond genius, in fact. Genius is not even a word. And an absolute impossibility to build up by any incremental step, but let me leave that aside for a minute. Then we've got these specialized components now, vitamins, minerals, trace elements. All of those are actually necessary. Many of them actually help the amino acids to work or help the proteins that the amino acids build up to work, particularly in relation to the vitamins. Minerals do amazing things. We know things like iron sits in the middle of hemoglobin and helps us to actually attach the oxygen, and it's just the way the electrons are transferred. And it's brilliant the way it does that because it collects the oxygen from the air. And if we had time again, I'd talk about the fetal hemoglobin relative to the adult hemoglobin, because fetal hemoglobin has to be stronger at hanging on to the oxygen than adult hemoglobin because it's got to pull it off the mum. Brilliant. And then when they're born, of course, that all swaps over and becomes adult hemoglobin. Anyway, lots of things that happen in there. But some of the other minerals, now most of you would know things like magnesium. Yeah? Now magnesium's good for you, isn't it? What do you think it's good for? Yeah, good for your muscles. Anything else? Nervous system, helps you to sleep. So magnesium is used in a variety of different things. One of the reasons why it's actually helpful, even when it comes to actually relaxing you, and people will often use it in formula associated with calming, reducing stress and anxiety, is because magnesium is actually a little molecule, sits in the middle of the brain. Well, it's used within the brain in a particular group of receptors, what we call N-methyl-D-aspartate or NMDA type receptors. They're a glutamate subtype receptor, which is all about driving things, and your glutamate receptors are driving things all the time. One of the things when you're stressed is that this overrides some of the brake that's in the brain, which is actually more the GABA system. But magnesium, if it's around, will actually sit in the middle of that NMDA receptor and actually turn it off or slow it down. So if you're low in magnesium, it's possible that you have what we call NMDA excitotoxicity, or that potentially is part of it. It's not the only thing, there's a number of things. But it's just fascinating where some of these trace elements work. Zinc, in fact, works in a very similar way, slightly differently in a different part, but can work in a different way. Incidentally, very hard to overdose on magnesium, but you can overdose on zinc. So just be conscious of that. And then, of course, the essential fatty acids, omega-3s, omega-6s. Now, we have lots of fats in the body, don't we? If you melted it all down, yes, you could make soap out of us. There is lots of fat in the body. Pretty much all the fats you make, but two that you can't make are the omega-3s and the omega-6s. Do you know what you use omega-3s for? Are omega-3s good for you? Are omega-6s good for you? Yes, omega-6s you actually need twice as many as 3s. It's just that your diet has huge amounts of omega-6s, so I could pretty much confidently say from here you never need to supplement with an omega-6, though I've seen ads for it. But omega-3s you do. And omega-6s, actually one of their major functions is actually to produce what we call the pro-inflammatory leukotrienes and things like that. The omega-3s actually produce the anti-inflammatory. So omega-6s predominantly pro-inflammatory, though there is an anti-inflammatory component. Omega-3s are predominantly anti-inflammatory, so slowing down the immune system. So you actually do need omega-3s. They're what we call essential. The body can't make them. Not sure where we're going with that. And then we have hormones, polyphenols, flavonoids. These all come essentially. They work in ways which are actually surprising to us. The body is predominantly oxidative. Do you know what that means? Predominantly, we're actually probably hurting ourselves. When we metabolize, we are actually generating lots of free radicals, and the body generally would burn itself out. The antioxidants, and we've got professional enzymes, I mentioned a couple of them yesterday, but those enzymes, as well as some of the components, particularly that we get from fruit and veggies, and that's these polyphenols, the flavonoids, these are actually antioxidant. They donate electrons, so they actually allow the body not to burn itself out. So the more of those you can get, the better. Does that make sense? Where do you get lots of those from? Fruit, veggies, berries, yes, all of that sort of thing. So we could almost end the talk there. And then we've got, now I've called them bulking agents just to keep a healthy gut. So probiotics, or I should say in this case prebiotics, which keep the bacteria in the gut happy. And the bacteria in the gut do all sorts of things, including producing some of our, they in fact produce quite a bit of GABA, which the body uses. Again, that's the part of the brain, or part of one of the neurotransmitters that actually slow down the brain, which is good. It also produces lots of short-chain fatty acids, which are needed not only to keep the gut healthy, but also help the body metabolically, so that we use sugar and that type of thing a whole lot better. So a healthy gut's really important. Fiber really is critical within that context. So these are the 6 things. We need something for fuel. We need the building materials. We need specialized components like trace elements, vitamins, minerals. Something that modulates some of our inflammatory activity, and that's particularly the polyphenols, things like that. The agents that actually keep our bugs healthy. We aren't healthy if we don't have bugs. And then ultimately we need hydration, something that keeps our body functioning. We're about 65% or so water, depending on the day. And I'll probably only be 50% by the time I step down from here in front of the lights. But water is extremely important. And water is the best way to hydrate, isn't it? Okay. I'm tempted to tell you a very quick story, but I better leave it. All right. Look, it's a very quick story. There was a particular guy who decided that he would drive from Adelaide up through the centre of Australia. He wanted to get up to, Darwin, I think, was his eventual goal. Didn't do a lot of planning. He decided that he would take his 1975 Corolla and just head up the Unadata track, and up he went. Anyway, as it turned out, his car broke down somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and so, being the planner that he was, decided that he would just go off and walk. Anyway, he got a fair way. Unfortunately, he was smart enough to know, well, gee, I'm running out of, I'm feeling pretty thirsty. I better go back to the car and look and see if I put a bottle of water in there. He didn't put any water in there, but he thought, well, I know the radiator has some water in it, along with its antifreeze. And so he went and he started guzzling the radiator water. Now, fortunately, not long after that, somebody came along and picked him up and took him to the nearest town. In which case then, and this is just what made me think of it, he commenced rehydration using alcohol. Now, as it turns out, so he managed to get an appointment with the RFDS, who happened to be coming in the next day. And it's a great story because basically he actually saved himself from severe damage, both to his eyes, his liver, etc., because the polyethylene glycol that he would have ingested and the body would have metabolized would have actually produced a really toxic free radical that would have damaged a lot of his organs and tissues. But the way to stop the body from metabolizing it is to actually put alcohol on the top. And so it makes those enzymes that would normally be metabolizing that, they metabolize the alcohol. And so he actually did the right thing. But not for any of us. Water is probably the best thing, unless you want to drink radiator fluid and then do it. So anyway, if the diet is deficient in any of those, then we will get disease, we will get sick. Make sense? The body needs them. We need to be able to supply them. So if we have a look and see what is the body from an acceptable point of view in order to reduce the chronic risk of disease. Now, there's a lot of work that's been done, and not everything that's been done in modern science, even in the last couple of years, has been bad. Some of it's actually been very good. And if we have a look at it, we need around about, in order to maintain health, we need around about 45 to 65% of our calories coming from carbohydrates, around 20 to 35% coming from fats, less than 10% from saturated fats, and then about 15 to 25% from protein. And I like to just think of it more of like carbohydrate, 55, fats around about 25, and then protein around about 20. So 55, 25, 20. That's a pretty good rule of thumb. And if you've got a diet which is fitting in around about that, then you're probably doing fairly well. The body seems to like that, and there's a fair bit of data supporting that. So 55, 25, 20. Now, if we have a look at the paleo diet, so the paleo diet, a little bit of a fad diet, intended to emulate the food patterns eaten by humans during the Paleolithic or caveman period, hunter-gatherer greater than 10,000 years ago. That's the official position. I'm not sure how many people were around greater than 10,000 years ago, but I'll leave that up to you and maybe we can discuss that later. But the point being is that, at least according to this particular group, what they're saying is, well, they wouldn't have had cows, so therefore dairy is out. They weren't actually growing crops, therefore grains and legumes and that type of thing is out. Refined sugars wouldn't have been around, and processed oils wouldn't have been around, because basically at that period of time, as the theory goes, or I should say as the story goes, they go around and club things on the head and drag it back and, break it open, eat it raw and sometimes cook it. And that's the paleo diet. So carbohydrates. So from their point of view, non-starchy fruits and vegetables, because you would have just, the occasional sweet potato that grew out of the ground, you could have put that up, and the pumpkin, and of course any of the fruits that were growing on the trees would have been okay. Fats would have been fairly significant in that particular diet, given the theory. So 30 to 40%, remember we said 55, 25, 20. So 55 carbohydrate, 25 fats, 20 proteins. So this is looking a little bit higher in terms of the fats. And then the protein sitting around about 19 to 35% of kilojoules in this hunter-gatherer diet. So what do we see there? Well, basically we've got an increased protein. We've got significantly increased in fats, and particularly in this case saturated fats. and a reduction overall in the amount of grains that are coming in. Now, you can get a lot of nutrients from fats. You also get a lot of nutrients from berries, greens, fruits. But you're also missing out on a lot of stuff if you're not getting the carbohydrates coming from things like grains. Now, I know there's been books written like Grain Brain, etc., and I'd love to sort of take some of those as questions if we have time later on. But the important thing is, if we've got whole grains, so we're talking healthy ones, that have been prepared appropriately. And a lot of what we're doing now with grains is something that I find actually can be quite damaging to us because we're not preparing them properly. But again, we'll cover that off a little bit later on. So how does it all work? Now, my screen there has kind of lost me a bit, so I'm going to work from here. So if we have a look at the diet, we know we've got fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. How does all that work? Well, if we start off with the carbohydrates, and these are the ones that you're going to get from starches like breads. You get it from a lot of things, even from legumes. You're certainly getting some of the carbohydrates coming through from nuts and seeds and things like that as well. But essentially, the body is going to convert those, and it'll make either, and I can't point, which I'm so tempted and wish I could, but it will actually make them both through. Some of them will contain fructose, particularly if they're up around, if they're the fruits and that type of thing. But a lot of it also, particularly the starches, will produce lots of things like glucose. Body's very good at being able to handle that, uses the glucose, uses the fructose, generates energy. When there's too much of it coming in, it'll put some of it out as glycogen. In fact, it'll do that anyway. It wants to increase those glycogen stores. They're the ones, as we all know, places like the liver, so that you've got a little bit of energy storage later on. And it'll also make a number of fats out of the fructose. Now, just as a quick comment about fructose, which I'll do that a little bit later. The brain particularly loves carbohydrates, and I know there's some popular thinking around using particularly the paleo diet for some of the brain disorders. Again, we can talk about that a little bit later on. There's a reason why they work for things like epilepsy, and it's not because they're actually making the brain work better. It's actually the brain doesn't use them as efficiently, so it actually makes the brain work less efficiently. And because epilepsy is because you get this non-specific firing, what's called ectopic firing, firing when it shouldn't do, slowing the brain down a bit actually reduces that significantly. Does that make sense? So the brain likes to use that. Fats are really your professional storage form. So if there is a famine for whatever reason, then if you've got enough adipose tissue on you, then you're going to survive. I won't live very long. I might last a couple of weeks. Some people could last a couple of months. But the point is that the body will actually store that around the body. Not so bad when it's subcutaneous, when it's just sitting underneath the skin. But once it starts sitting around the organs, and unfortunately for me, I don't actually store much fat in terms of around my body. But if I start storing fat, I'll actually start storing it around the organs. So I could easily become somebody who was a thin, unhealthy person. And that certainly does happen. So fats are actually your professional storage form. Body likes to use them for emergencies. Great to sort of give you that unique body shape. Body actually likes to have it also to give you a little bit of insulation. I know I surf with a friend of mine, well, he's my brother-in-law, but lives off down Torquay down in the south of Australia. Now, he'll go surfing in just a spring suit out off, Torquay there. And I've got to put on a full steamer because I absolutely freeze. And he thinks I look fit, but I just think to myself, yeah, well, I wish I had a little bit more insulation because he survives very nicely. I struggle. All right, and fat stores, yes, adipose tissue, as I mentioned. And what about the proteins? Well, the proteins aren't intended for fuel. The body has to work very hard to make fuel out of proteins. Now, a lot of people are moving down that track and wanting to do it for different reasons. Again, nice to have some chats if we can. But the body doesn't like it. It actually has to work very, very hard, and that's one of the reasons why you can actually lose weight on a high-protein, high-fat diet, because the body likes to make the professional things out of it, the enzymes, that type of thing, out of those amino acids. It doesn't like to make fuel out of it. It can if it has to, but it is a true emergency. And as I mentioned, glucose, fructose, so glucose is just missing a couple of arrows there, but they finally go down. So what happens if you eat too much carbohydrate, particularly of the simple carbohydrate? Too much of that coming in, glucose goes up, glycogen storage, they'd get full pretty quickly, blood glucose comes in, shoots the insulin up because the body doesn't like blood glucose, because blood glucose, if it's high, what does it do? Blood glucose actually starts to stick things. And we mentioned that yesterday. Does anybody remember what the name of that was? When you actually start getting lots of glucose sticking onto things, it produces what we call advanced glycation end products. The acronym is AGE, or AGEs. And just remember this one thing, AGEs age you. They do. They actually create cross-links in the skin, they damage tissue within various organs. So you don't want glucose high because they will produce AGEs, these advanced glycation end products. In fact, I could tell you about companies that have spent, well, at least a couple of $1 billion trying to find something that kicks AGEs out of the brain as people get older, because it's thought to play a role in some of the neurodegenerative disorders, the development of something like Alzheimer's. Now, we did some studies back in about 2014. One of my PhD students was looking at some of the inflammatory markers in the CSF, and we could actually see. So we actually measured the advanced glycation end products in the brains of people from the age of about, I think we had 8 through to 79. And you could see the AGEs accumulating in the brain as people got over the age of 45 particularly. Now, do you know one of the highest sources of advanced glycation end products, apart from your own blood sugar going up? Do you know what's the highest source that's in the literature? Which one? Fried foods? Yes. Do you know a specific fried food that's highest? So if I fry my toast, or let's say I toast my bread, it goes up from about 12, and I won't tell you what the units are, but anyway, it goes up from about 12 to 36. Your body can cope with that. If you fry your veggies will go up from around about 25 or so to about 200. Still probably okay. The highest that's in the literature so far is actually a Big Mac at around about 7,000. It's huge. So again, you can eat it because this is actually a stimulator. It's just glucose binding with one of the with one of the amino groups on proteins. That's how you make advanced glycation end products. You can make it yourself. You can make it internally, having high sugars, but you can also eat it. And again, we could see we don't know what caused everybody's high, but as you get older, you get less able to kick it out. So not a good thing to have. So problems with high glucose, yes, insulin goes up, and that has its own problems. It actually stimulates fat deposition around the belly and that type of thing as well. Increased blood glucose, as I mentioned, AGEs, the advanced glycation end products, that increases what we call oxidative stress or free radical damage. The immune system gets involved, inflammation starts. That creates a chronic inflammatory environment. And when you think about how often we have these foods, it's easy to see how you can create this inflammatory environment that's going on all of the time. And it also increases things like triglycerides. So triglycerides are probably better in terms of their correlation to cardiovascular disease than cholesterol. The only one probably better than that maybe is oxidized cholesterol. And then, of course, the fat stores, and that contributes to your ability to survive, of course, in any kind of food deficit. Now, the idea of fructose, a lot of people are saying fructose is bad for you. How many people think fructose is good for you? Yeah, I do too. Fructose bad for you? Yeah, I do too. So it's actually both. So fructose that are coming from whole fruits, it's actually really good for you. And even as a diabetic, you could have fructose because fructose doesn't actually push up your blood sugar. So fructose is metabolized, it actually metabolizes a little bit further down the pathway. You generate energy out of it really efficiently. It's good. The only trouble is because it generates energy efficiently, doesn't produce advanced glycation end products, so it's good from all of that. But because it produces energy very efficiently, it will very quickly supply all the energy you need, and then any excess gets shunted off and you make triglycerides out of it. Another term for that is fats. Yeah? And so very quickly you replenish the stores, and once you've got all of that replenished, if you're going to put more carbohydrate, even if it's glucose or anything else on top, the body's blood sugar just goes up because the body's going, I've got enough. All right, so yeah, makes lots of triglycerides. And so, yeah, fat deposition, fatty liver, triglycerides go up, even the very low density lipoprotein was not so good, so can promote metabolic syndrome. All right, health and carbohydrates. Natural source, good for the body. The body likes carbohydrates. Get complex carbohydrates. There's almost no time when you should actually be having simple carbohydrates, unless you are a diabetic or for some other reason have gone into a hypo. Does that make sense? And yet we do it all of the time. And this goes for even the fruit juices. Fruit juices, and the studies have been done where, it used to be just those drinks that are made, the soft drinks and that type of thing were considered bad. Well, the fruit juices are actually as bad as the soft drinks. And it doesn't matter that you've got a little bit of orange pulp in there or guava pulp or whatever it might be. It's giving you a massive hit of basically just very simple sugar. And the body has to deal with that. And we deal with it less efficiently as we get older, but it doesn't mean that we're dealing with it well as we're younger. One of the things that I'll mention, particularly for young children as they're growing through, there's 2 times when the brain is developing massively, what we call a synaptic explosion. One is just when they're born, just after they're born, and the brain is actually literally trying to wire going, what does they mean when they have that expression, and how do I walk and how do I talk? And that's gone for about the first 3 or 4 years. Then it slows down until they get to puberty, and then it ramps up again. And the brain now is actually developing because you've got the secondary sex characteristics kicking in, and now you've got the frontal lobe starting to develop because the brain develops from the back to the front. So the frontal lobes are starting to develop now, and they're trying to wire particularly their midbrain associated with all the emotions, and they're trying to make decisions and all of that kind of thing. If you're putting things into that child's brain, whether they're young or whether they're old, and sugar is one of them, that can actually affect the capacity for the brain to wire up appropriately. If they keep getting dosed up on high sugars, it's driving particularly some of the pathways that are associated with reward. Now, we know we do that anyway with the electronic devices, and there's a bunch of other ways in which you can scramble a child's brain. But it is just one, and one to be conscious of. So, but a very good source if it's a complex carbohydrate. So, best for blood sugar, triglycerides and fats, insulin resistance, yet simple carbohydrates. We know what the problem is with all of those. We know what they look like. And I don't have to ask you, do they taste good? Of course they do. I mean, there's a reason why I don't have chocolate in the house. And I've said to people in the past, in some of the work that I do, I might be given for Christmas a big, box of chocolates. Well, literally, I've taken that box. Now, fortunately, my wife doesn't like chocolates, so there's no fight there, which is very unusual. But anyway, so I can just take that box of chocolates and I can put it in the bin. And I know there's people in the audience that will go, just give them to me. Well, I can't. That would be unethical. But if I don't, I can guarantee I'll find a good excuse to eat those chocolates. And once I start, I have no problem putting away a whole box of chocolates. That would work very well for me. So anyway, as I talked about, advanced glycation end product, oxidative stress, heart disease, all the rest of it, complex carbohydrates, that's what we're really after. Bran cereals, oranges, apples, basically the way God intended it. If you can do it that way, largely, I mean, there's got to be some preparation for some of these things, but that's actually going to be the healthiest form to get your carbohydrates in. And they're good. As I said, when it comes to things like legumes, and I'll just mention it at the end, but making sure that they're prepared properly, usually soaked and then cooked well. Soaked, rinsed, and cooked. All right, so carbohydrate, excellent fuel for the body if you get it from whole food, complex carbohydrate sources. Yeah, and don't overdo it. So what happens if you eat too much fat? This is the other version. So now coming down on the left-hand side of the screen for you, what about the fats? They're going to come in. The body actually will use fats. It generates ketone bodies out of them, can use them very efficiently. The brain actually still needs to make glucose. So it can function, it can probably function off about 75% on a keto, but 25% it would still have to generate some of its own sugar or generate it from somewhere. Usually the liver will do it. But ketone bodies can be used by the rest of the body. Now, most people won't stay on a keto diet because it's not very, it can be palatable, but it's something that generally the body tends to start to reject after a while. It's not something that the body likes to continue doing. Ketone bodies, yes, cell energy. Gut cells use it all the time. You find that, the term satiety, which just means, you're feeling full. Fats and proteins are very good at making you feel full. And there's a reason for that. because both fats and proteins the body doesn't need a lot of. So once you start putting them into the body fairly quickly sends signals going, hey, stop, we don't need any more fuel here, I'm full. So good for increasing satiety. Yep, helps to decrease blood glucose, at least initially, unless then you're actually still taking some carbohydrate in potentially. And even if not, it can have an effect because of the triglyceride and the energy load can actually affect insulin sensitivity. Problems with it, increased ketone bodies. Look, they are going to decrease the pH, and there are issues associated with having a reduction in pH. Certainly seems to flare up some of the inflammatory activity, certainly seems to flare up things like rheumatoid arthritis in joints, etc. Increases triglycerides, oxidative stress again, inflammation as I mentioned, more oxidized cholesterol, altered gut microbiota. Yes, it does increase the anaerobic forms, and I used to work as head of one of the clinical microbiology units, and one of the things that you would have to do in the morning is actually read what we call the anaerobic plates. So with a good microbiologist, they can take the plate out and sniff to see whether or not what's growing there. Well, the last thing you want to do is sniff an anaerobic plate. You're probably better off being a sewage worker than that. So not very pleasant, and therefore can increase, unfortunately, some of the antisocial elements of some of these kind of diets. All right, and decreases phytonutrient intake because the fats generally are not dissolving some of the things that we would get normally as phytonutrients, which tend to often be, well, they'll be fat soluble as well as water soluble, but we tend not to get them from the foods that have them. So a couple of just quick things there. Key messages, this is for cardiovascular health, particularly with dietary fat, and there's been a lot of controversy over the years. Again, we might get some questions at the end. Is it really bad for you or not? This is from 2018, so relatively recently. Cardiovascular health, substantial evidence supports the importance of the type of fat consumed, not so much total fat, and the elimination of industrial produced trans fats. In fact, we've actually done some studies ourselves. We do a technique called what's called pulse wave velocity. So if your arteries are nice and healthy, it'll be like a nice flexible hose. The artery wall will just flex nicely like this, and the velocity of that flex from, say, the carotid artery down to the femoral artery will be quite slow. But if they're an unhealthy artery and they're hard and they're stiff, that flex will actually be it'll be very small, and that'll actually be very rapid. So we can actually measure what we call pulse wave velocity all the way from the carotid through to the femoral artery. And literally we've fed people different diets of fats and different things, and we can show you that there are fats. If I feed you just an ice cream meal, you will definitely increase your pulse wave velocity. In other words, it's doing what we call damage to those cells that are lining the artery and just making them stiffer and a little bit more stressed. It does happen in one meal, and we can certainly measure that. It probably dissipates after about 6 hours for most people. So much of the evidence suggests that the risk of coronary heart disease is reduced by replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, including the plant oils, but not when you put lots of carbohydrates in there as well. And that makes sense. So controversies still remain, but basically it looks like the plant oils are good. But you can also, and there are papers out there, and I know when we talk about the Mediterranean diet, a lot of people say, yeah, a few other issues as well. Some people do tolerate a lot easier than others, and it depends on how far you go with the ketogenic. So often when people are doing this properly, they'll actually measure their level of ketones and try and keep it within a certain range. There are reasons why you might want to track down this even for a short period of time, but it's not something that the body overall is going to find as healthy to sustain itself on. So longer term effects can include decreased bone mineral density, nephrolithiasis, which is just kidney stones, problems with the heart, which is the cardiomyopathy, anemia, as most of us know, so you're basically not producing the red cells that you need to, problems with oxidation. It doesn't like the fats in that way, which is why it tends not to do it. It actually gets the rest of the body to do it, but it will generate oxidative stress. And in terms of brain exposure to saturated fats, what I can say is the brain doesn't like saturated fats. If I want to reduce your IQ points by a couple, I can easily do that by giving you a saturated fat diet. And I learned this the hard way. I went to, I remember in taking a second year biochemistry exam, and I remember going to my lecturer beforehand, and this is obviously a number of years ago, and I said to him, look, is there anything I should have for lunch? You know, I've got this straight after, this exam straight after lunch, 3-hour exam. And I knew there'd be a lot of pathways I would need to remember in there. And I said, should I eat anything different for lunch or maybe skip lunch? He goes, no, it doesn't matter what you eat. So, of course, going into the cafeteria and you see there for lunch is all this nice starchy fried food as well as ice cream. And being, what was I then, 18, thought that was a terrific idea and so hoed into the whole lot, including all of the ice cream. And you have no idea how dull I felt. Normally I'll finish an exam fairly quickly. Oh, I was still struggling to get through that exam all the way to the end of that 3 hours. Now, fortunately, I did reasonably well, but at the same time, I tell you what, you absolutely struggled and had to force yourself to think. It wasn't that normal clarity of thought. One other quick example, and this brought it home to me before I was convicted on any of this. I was doing some graduate work and I had to go to the University of Melbourne. I was learning a technique for dissecting a little part of the brain out called the hippocampus. And I happened to I needed a break. They had McDonald's next door, so I went next door and got a bit of Macca's. And I came back and I was reading some papers that I'd been reading before and then came back and I could not concentrate. I remember it so clearly today because it was something where I felt pretty clear on sifting through this issue beforehand. But after eating that Macca's for about 2 hours, I couldn't think as clearly. Now look, it's probably one of those things maybe affects me just more than other people, but certainly the effect has been demonstrated and it has been documented. The brain doesn't like saturated fat. And as mentioned just there in the last sentence, some of those effects associated with the saturated fat on the brain seem to contribute to things like cognitive decline. Now this last one, look, when you get out and have a look at systematic reviews, 3 out of 4 will tell you that saturated fat is bad for you. In more recent times, we've had some papers that have come through and suggested, at least one paper that's come through and suggested that it might not be as bad for you. There's reasons where I guess we can argue down that path, and again, we might want to talk about that afterwards. But overall, I would say saturated fat's probably not so great. But what about the proteins? So again, particularly in a paleo-type diet, you're pushing protein and you're pushing fat. Is there any benefit in all of that? So remember the proteins, what their main role is to produce those structural elements, those factory-type elements for the body on the left-hand side, or at least on your right-hand side. They can produce, okay, you don't need to know that, but that's, I wish I had a pointer. But anyway, it just, yeah, we'll go to that one. You probably don't need that one either. But the point that is, that's all the different amino acids. This is actually the pathway associated with where you generate energy from, that's the big circle in the middle, that's called the tricarboxylic acid cycle. And this is just where different amino acids, all those ones you see on the outside, they can actually come in and you can actually produce energy from those. in different ways. Now, because you're producing them from different parts of it, you will produce ketone bodies in some, you can produce glucose directly from others, but you won't produce it from all of them. But the bottom line is you can actually produce the gluconeogenesis, which can also then produce ketone bodies, from those ones that are in yellow. So you can actually produce those. What's the consequences of relying on gluconeogenesis? In other words, remember that the body, particularly the brain, needs glucose, so the body's got to make glucose from something. If you're not giving it carbohydrate, just giving it fats and proteins, it's not going to make it from the fats, it has to make it from the proteins, and it's got to work very hard. What are some of the consequences for that? Well, initially your blood sugar is low, but actually because of the metabolic stress, it can actually increase fasting blood sugar over time because the body's under such stress. It'll increase that drive for generating glucose. It'll also form lots of ketone bodies, which again, you've got very acidic, so you're actually generating lots of protons, which the body then needs to deal with that. You generate a metabolic acidosis. And again, as I said, metabolic acidosis, well, eventually it can kill you, but it actually puts the body under more stress. The kidneys do need to try and get rid of it, and there are issues with that. A lot of people talk about, you lose a lot of calcium. Well, you do actually, because calcium actually dissolves more efficiently in an acid urine. So somebody who's on a diet like this, the pH of their urine, so does anybody know what the pH of normal pH would be, or neutral pH? 7. Neutral pH is 7. So if you're on a diet like this, do you know what your pH will be in the urine? Yeah, it'll be around about 5, maybe even slightly through the tubules. It's got some brilliant ways of doing it. Now, it's trying to reabsorb all of your calcium, but if calcium likes to stay in an acid urine, it's not going to be as effective. So you're going to actually lose more calcium as it gets leached out, as well as some of the other things like magnesium and potentially some of the others as well, zinc probably as well. So that metabolic acidosis overall makes the body work a lot harder. So you get a reduced phytonutrient intake because you're using foods generally that don't contain the same level of phytonutrients. High intake of particularly branched chain amino acids. And the branched chains, if anybody's interested, that's just leucine, isoleucine, and valine. So leuci, isoleuci, and val. So there are problems associated with that, and so may predispose to metabolic disease. Okay. All right, I'll keep going. High protein diets induce acid load on the kidneys. They really do. And particularly if it's so there's a little bit of a difference between vegetarian protein or protein from vegetarian sources and protein from animal sources. Key things are amino acids. So in vegetarian sources, you get more of things like arginine and cysteine. Now, arginine particularly, does anybody know what's good about arginine? Okay, so in order for the heart pumps, pushes blood out, and the arteries have got to relax, haven't they? So hopefully they relax, and if they relax nicely, then your blood pressure will be nice, somewhere around 120/80. If the arteries are stiff, pushes it out, the arterial pressure is actually much higher because the arteries are stiff, and you might be up around about 140, 150. Now, what makes those arteries nice and relaxed, or one of the reasons, is actually the availability of nitric oxide. And the way the body makes nitric oxide is it converts arginine to citrulline using an enzyme called nitric oxide synthase. But anyway, it just converts arginine into citrulline, makes nitric oxide out of it. So if you have lots of arginine, you've got more available nitric oxide and therefore more relaxed arteries. Make sense? So another reason why veggie diets are actually, in terms of this particular element, is better. High protein diets induce acid load on the kidneys. They can actually damage your kidneys, and particularly as you get older, where you only start off with about 1 million neurons in each kidney. It's not a lot. It's easy to damage them. I don't have time to tell you another story, I don't think. Yep, no, definitely not. All right. So even short-term high protein significantly affects glomerular function, so basically kidney function. So you need to be really careful with that. High protein diets increase risk of calcium stone formation. You don't want to have a stone, whether it's a calcium stone or whether it's anything else. And as I mentioned, because they're acid, you get much more calcium in there. If you've got anything, what we call oxalates, that are there as well, that'll be a calcium oxalate. If you're not drinking enough, which often people don't within those contexts, particularly of water, then of course you can get those precipitating out, and that'll be a calcium oxalate stone. Very common, very painful, can do a lot of damage to the kidneys as well. Okay, so consequences of relying on gluconeogenesis, I'll skip through those, basically not good. Key thing at the bottom there, protein restriction over carbohydrate restriction, and it's been around for some time. Even some colleagues of mine at the University of Sydney, some of the early work being done on that, showing basically that it is more associated, because we've all heard that limiting some of your dietary intake can actually increase your longevity. You've all heard that, haven't you? So fasting is actually connected with living longer. Some people just say that you feel like you're living longer. But it's actually not so much even just that. It actually seems to be a restriction in things like protein. Things. It's the one that actually helps you generate energy. It's called nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. It's the one that actually helps you repair the DNA, particularly base excision repair. It actually stimulates what we call, well, it's actually used as a substrate for what we call the longevity enzymes. Now, any of you, if you go away from here, most of you probably won't have any reception, but anyway, if you do have some, just Google NAD and aging. And what you'll see is that basically there's a real popular movement at the moment for people to sell things to boost your NAD levels. Well, ours were actually the first papers to actually show that NAD decreases with age back in about 2010. So it was our group that actually did most of that early work. And we're still looking at some of the things. Yeah, it's important for the immune system. It is a neurotransmitter. It is actually necessary when we talk about the sleep, which comes up in a couple of days' time. NAD is actually necessary to actually switch on and keep the sleep-wake cycles going in a little part of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Again, only about 20,000 neurons, but really important. So having a good NAD is important. And yeah, you've heard of telomeres? Yeah. Well, NAD, you need NAD in order to make the telomeres particularly simple carbohydrates. Now, it's not that simple carbohydrates don't activate it, but what simple carbohydrates do is they actually stimulate part of the pathway which is linked to reward. So some of the reward pathways where you're actually getting a bit of a high from having that sugar. That's tasty. I like it. And the brain's going, I want more of that. And so that's why it's so much easier when you have one chocolate. It's much easier to have the second one. And so much easier to have the third one. And if you like me, down to about the 20th one. And that is because, not because these aren't working, it's because the reward pathway is overriding it. So fats and proteins aren't that tasty on their own. And they switch off those. But fats actually with, fats with sugars are pretty tasty, but not very good for you either. So anyway, exercise is a great way of reducing the stress response. We talk more about that tomorrow, and we can cover that off. So fairly quickly, main benefit of high protein, high carb diets have been weight loss. Proportion of energy obtainable from a high protein diet limited to 30%. So increased fatty acid oxidation decreases appetite, etc. But high fats increase ketone bodies, increase acidosis. That's not a good thing. You reduce the vitamin intake, particularly of some of the B vitamins. And look, I think we do have, and particularly as we get older, because you get less capacity to absorb, but there probably is a bit of a B6 deficiency. Love to do your NADs. We'll tell you that's B3 is actually one of the things that produce the NAD very efficiently. But certainly magnesium, also another real key area of deficiency, zinc as well. And phytonutrients are limited. So increased risk of constipation for a whole variety of reasons. Alter the gut microbiota, as I mentioned. Decrease the ability of some of the adipokines to stimulate normal fatty acid oxidation, and may cause liver and kidney problems. Okay, increased oxidative stress, cardiovascular disease, all of that's there. And as I mentioned, the evidence suggests that there seems to be a reduction in longevity related to some of that metabolic activity. Remember, when you're relying on the proteins, you've got to work, the body's got to work very hard to make that useful. So, Mediterranean vegan, as I mentioned, I would mention it just very briefly. What is a Mediterranean diet? And this is the definition. Contains 3 to 9 serves of vegetables, half to 2 serves of fruit, 1 to 13 serves of cereals, up to 8 serves of olive oil daily. Contained approximately 9,300 kilojoules. How many kilojoules do you need per day for an average man, let's just say? 8,700 to 9,000, somewhere around about there. Women a little bit less than that. 18%, so 37% total fat, probably on the high end with all that olive oil. 18% monounsaturated, 7% saturated, 33 grams of fibre per day. So look, basically nothing wrong with the Mediterranean diet. It has been very effective in many health studies, depending on how people actually apply it. Lots of fruits and veggies is always good. You don't have to label it as anything. Just get lots of fruits and veggies into the diet. Does that make sense? A vegan diet, well, we all know what that is. Somebody who basically doesn't want to eat anything that comes from an animal largely. Some of them include honey in that. I don't. And that can be an excellent diet. In fact, I am a vegan. But you do have to maintain, you know, a little bit of sense about it, particularly in the context of, you know, the supply of foods we get. And lacto-ovo, nothing wrong with that as well. There's some very good things in eggs, and potentially even dairy, though less so. So nutrients the body needs. We need the fuel. Carbohydrates, fats. Let's not get them on their own. Let's make sure that we get them with some protein, but also the specialized components, the vitamins, trace elements, minerals, omega-3s, omega-6s, lots of those polyphenols. We want to make sure that we get plenty of those in there as well. And ultimately, fiber, which we get from those, and hydration. So I just want to finish off with this last slide. And if I can just so 30% of the diet made up of whole grains, ideally. 30% of the diet from veggies would be ideal. 15% from nuts and legumes, 15% from fruits. You can shift that around a little bit. I know people have been sensitive about fruits. I personally aren't. I think that fruits can be good, as long as you keep in mind that a lot of the fruits that are bred these days, we used to get, have a much higher sugar content, was what I was going to say. We used to get, sort of 10 kilo berries that we used to get in bulk. And we used to get them as the wild berries. You used to have to get them from Canada. They weren't supplying them anymore, so we were only getting the local blueberries. Look, the difference is absolutely marked. You know, a wild blueberry is this rich, red, small, little bit tart, a little bit of sugar in there, but a little bit of tart. Whereas now when we get our blueberries, I mean, they're plump and big, and I'm sure there's still lots of good things in them, but there's certainly a whole lot of extra sugar, probably a good 5 or more times. So just be conscious of that. Dairy alternatives. Limit treats made up of sugars and fats. Really? And I shouldn't have to tell you that. And you know, you do have to make a kind of a line in the sand. As I said, I'm I'm a scientist. I don't have to be diplomatic. I just have to tell you what is. This is actually not something that you can live off, not for very long. You will hurt yourself. This is just a government guide, and I've just put around the outside if that is of any benefit to anybody. But let me go to this last slide, just to make these last final comments. So whole food, plant-based products provide excellent nutrition. Absolutely. And the data is there. We probably don't need any more data. Make sure you wash all your fruits and veggies before use. Huge amount of things being used on them which you wouldn't want in the body. And I have definitely talked with providers of these types of things, particularly things like strawberries, and I know that they won't eat their own strawberries. Just make sure that you do wash them properly. So make a habit of doing that. Any of the greens, like there's great to have the cruciferous veggies like broccoli, etc., with all of the, there's anti-cancer elements in that and all that sort of thing, which is great, the sulforaphanes. But you really want to make sure that you wash them, because it is hard to get a lot of the pesticides out of them because of just the surface area. Make sure that you soak and properly prepare all grains and legumes. So some of you will have heard of phytates, particularly from the grains. You want to make sure that you get rid of most of those you can. And lectins. Has anybody heard of lectins? So lectins are in a whole range of different things, but some people are susceptible, and we suspect it might be either because of the stress they're under or because of the type of gut bacteria they may have. But lectins can actually drive inflammatory process, and particularly if they deposit out in some of the joints. And so can be a predisposition to things like sore joints and potentially rheumatoid arthritis. So the way to do that, of course, is to wash. So soak first, rinse, and then ultimately make sure that you wash and then cook well. A lot of the breads that we're eating, incidentally, are not treated that way in terms of the grains. And that will go even for the oats, like rolled oats and things like that. So just be a little bit conscious of those. Conscious of getting adequate amounts of particularly omega-3s, B12, zinc, and I could add magnesium to that. And look, just a little throwaway, and I know most of you probably will know this, but put the citric acid, so a little bit of lemon juice over the greens in order to, there's plenty of iron in greens, there's huge amounts. And people talk about, you need to go on to, and I've heard many GPs and people who have been advised by GPs to go, look, you need to get your iron up, make sure you have your heme iron, you're going to have to go on to a bit of red meat. Well, heme iron is just a reduced form of iron. And in a human body, you would get heme iron. Animals, you get heme iron. When you're getting it from plants, they're in what we call an oxidized form, so they've actually got one less electron. Now, it's easy to convert that. You just put a little bit of lemon juice on top of it, and you're converting it into heme iron, and then the absorption is terrific. So that's all you need to do. All right, I'm going to leave it there, and yes, all right. I don't think we have time for questions from the front.
Thank you, Ross. It's amazing how research is backing up God's blueprint. Let me read to you from Genesis chapter 1, verse 29. Then God said, "Look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant throughout the earth and all the fruit trees for your food." And let me read to you where we started, Isaiah 55, 1-3. The Lord God said, "Is anyone thirsty? Come and drink, even if you have no money. Come, take your choice. It's all free. Why spend your money on food that does not give you strength? Why pay for food that does you no good? Listen to me and you will eat what is good. You will enjoy the finest food. Come to me with your ears wide open. Listen and you will find life." Amen. May you enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thank you for coming.